It's time to tackle the lighting now. And since we'll be doing most of the editing of our lighting in the shader tree, let's expand this up. And the reason we'll be doing that is because our environment maps reside in the shader tree. And we also have our render settings in the shader tree. So first thing, let's go to the render settings. We want to turn off GI, which is global illumination. Over here under the global illumination tab. And to turn it off, you need to disable the indirect illumination. That's going to darken our scene right away. I also want to turn off our cellophane and render boolean because it's really hitting our preview render here. That should help out quite a bit. All right, so all we can see now is our one area light. And in the shader tree, if we expand out our lights here, we can select and edit our area light. We locked it previously in one of the videos, and now we need to unlock it. So right click, unlock. The first thing we want to edit with our area light is the simple shading, and this is really going to increase the quality quite a bit. And you'll notice the shadow right here behind the box change quite drastically as soon as we turn that off. You can see the quality is much nicer. It's a lot softer. And we also want to up the samples, and what that's going to do, it's going to increase the quality as well. Let's go up to 256. And I also want to increase the radiance a little bit. Let's try 1.7. That increases it to an acceptable level. I might come back and edit this a little bit later. Lighting, just like anything, is a lot of tweaking and trying things, and if it doesn't work, try something else. For now, I'm going to call that good. Now, along this right side of the box here, it's a little bit dark. And what I want to do is actually put in sort of a rim light, I suppose. And I want it to be graded from light to dark from the back to the front. So the front here will be a little bit darker, and right here will be a little bit lighter. And I'm going to use an area light focused on that section to do that. So let's right click on the area light to duplicate it. And we'll hide our previous area light. And in fact, we should really rename this right off so that way it doesn't get confusing. We'll just call this rim space area light. Okay, let's zoom out in our perspective view. And what we want to do is move and rotate this light. Let's activate the multi-transform tool with a Y key. We're going to move this toward the back over here. It looks like the action center is not quite right. So let's reset that. Just go to action center, set it automatic. We're going to move this just behind the box. We're doing this with world axes currently. We don't really care about the local axes just yet. Okay, so right about there is going to get us what we want. Now what we need to do is actually reset the scale that we have, because in a previous video we scaled the original light that we just duplicated. And you can see the scale here, it's quite large. And if we set this icon here to equals, just key in 100, it will set all of those to 100. And now we're going to set the action center to local. And what that's going to do is align our gizmo to the light. And now we can rotate this around and focus it on that back area of the box. So we'll rotate this around right about there. And I want to have it pointing slightly upward to simulate like the light is bouncing off something behind the box, but not too terribly steep of an angle. Right about there should do it. You may have noticed when you use one of the transform tools that the light has two little cyan gizmos on it. One of them controls the height and one of them controls the width. And what we want to do with this light is to actually use these. We want the light to be tall but somewhat skinny or thin. And the reason we want that is because we want to have a light that's a little bit taller than the box here, but we don't want it to affect too much of the surrounding area. And we'll use the width of the light to adjust the grading of the light on this side of the box here. All right, so let's activate the multi-transform tool again, and we'll scale this down on the width. We'll make this fairly thin. And now we'll do the same thing for the height. Grab that. And we need to move this in a little bit closer to the box, and I want that arrow or the center of that light to point more or less right at the corner of that box. And we'll have it hanging over a little bit onto the side rather than the back of the box. Looks like it needs to come down a little more as well. So now you can see that we're getting a graded light here, a gradient. It's not exactly how I want it. I want there to be a little more contrast from the back to the front. So, like I said previously, I want the back to be well lit and the front to be very dark. Let's activate one of the transform tools again. We're going to use the cyan gizmo for the width again. We're going to scale this down a little bit more. We're going to scale this down until the front of the box is pretty dark. All right. So something like that. And we may need to move this in a little bit closer. Yeah, that's pretty good. So we'll move this in a little bit closer to the box. Yeah, rotate around and let's look at the back. It looks like it's actually pointing more at the back. So let's move this slightly more to the side of the box. Okay, right about there is what we want. Now the light is more or less where I want it. It's a little too intense, so let's adjust the radiance. Let's just change this down to 1, which is generally the default for light. And that looks pretty good, actually. So we'll keep that setting. Now, we don't need the extra quality of having simple shading turned off. So we'll turn that back on. We can also decrease the amount of rays. We'll just go down to 64. Okay, so that looks pretty good. One last thing I want to do is to take a look at what's happening with our specular highlights. You can actually see that some of these specular highlights are being affected with this light, and that's great. And that's the other reason we're putting it over here, so that we can call out those cherries a little bit more. All right, so now we have our specular highlight showing up pretty well on one of the other little cherries. That looks pretty cool. But we also have light casting onto the ground plane or our light box, and we really don't want that. And there's a simple way of actually excluding this over here in the lights properties, and we actually have a way to include or exclude an item group. So let's set that up. Now what we want to do is to make a group that has our light box in it. So let's select our light box in the item list. Okay, now we need to go to the groups tab. We're going to add a new group by hitting new group. And for mode, we want from selected items. Okay, we'll just call this rim light excluder. Okay, that's fine. Let's go back to the properties tab, select our rim light. Now in the item group drop-down list, let's select our rim light excluder and then turn on control light linking. Now you can see that light is only affecting the box. And it's a really great way to control your lights if you don't want them casting rays onto a specific object or set of objects. Now that we have that complete, we can turn our other area light back on, hit the eyeball next to it. All right, looks pretty good, but the light is a little too bright on the back here, and we definitely don't want that. So let's go ahead and go back to our rim light, and we'll tweak the settings until we get a setting we do like. Let's go down to a radiance of 0.5. That's looking a lot better, and I quite like that. Now it's time to turn the global illumination back on, along with our environment maps. So let's go back to the render settings, global illumination, and turn on indirect illumination. All right, so now we have GI turned on. So now we need to tweak our environments to light the scene how we want them. And I want my scene to have a little bit of warm and cool colors in it. And we can use our environment maps for that as well as our lights. Before we do anything with our lights having color, we should really look at those environment maps because they're going to add a lot of light and color to our final render. Now the kitchen probe is actually a pretty warm image, and let's turn that off just for now and take a look at our environment material. Now, one of the previous videos, we tweaked this a little bit to get the colors we wanted, but it's not exactly where we want it. Now, I think it's a little too warm, so what we can do is adjust the opacity. We'll go down to 15%. So that should do just fine for this. Now let's activate our kitchen probe, and we'll be adding the warmer lights with that back into our scene. It's not exactly where I want it at the moment, and one of the ways we can tweak this is to adjust the blending mode. But first, let's turn off the environment material. You can see that it's not really adding much into the scene when we also have the kitchen probe on. And that's because we don't have a blend mode. Now the blend mode will allow us to modify the colors in various ways. And what we want to do with this one is to set it to screen, and that will allow a little bit more light to come through. But we also want to adjust those warm values to come down a little bit and to also lower the intensity of the lighting from this probe. So we can control the high value to do that. Let's change this to about 70%, and that brings it down just a little bit, but you can still see some warmer values in here. We also need to adjust the opacity a little bit. It's still just a little too strong. So we'll go down to 10% for this just to see what it looks like. And it's so close. I feel like it's missing a little bit of the warm hues in there. So let's change this to 15 and meet it halfway. Let's go ahead with that. We still have a little more tweaking to do with our GI before we're going to call that good. So let's go back to our render settings under GI. And you may have noticed that we have splotchiness on our light box, and we do not want that. That's obviously undesirable. So we need to up the quality of our GI. So two ways we're going to do this. The first being we're going to up the indirect rays for GI, and we'll go up to about 256. Nothing too crazy. That seems to help maybe a little bit, not a whole lot. Let's try 512. Well, it's helping a little bit. Okay, so now what we'll do, which will help a lot, is to turn on environment importance sampling. And you can see as soon as preview stops that the quality is drastically improved. That splotchiness is almost entirely gone. What we need to do is to increase the raise for environment importance sampling. Let's raise it up to 1024. This will drastically increase the quality, but render times will also take a pretty big hit. So we need to be careful not to increase the value too much. And if your scene requires a higher value, it's a good idea to work at a lower value. And then when you actually render, go back and change it to that higher value that you need. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. We could probably even just go down to 512. And that looks great. So we'll stick with 512 for our final render as well. Now that we have our basic render settings set up, we still need to up the lighting. It's a little dark. Let's go to our environment maps and actually click on the master environment. We need to increase the lighting to somewhere around 2.5 to 3. So let's just start out halfway, go to 2.75. All right. So that's a lot brighter, and it gives a nice evenly distributed amount of light into our scene. No, it looks good, but I still feel like there's a little something missing. And that something to me is some more ambient occlusion around the light box or ground plane and our box. And we can actually fake that instead of using GI to do that for us. We'll still allow GI to do its thing, but I want it to be a little more intense. So what we'll do is we'll just throw in an ambient occlusion shader. Let's go to our light box first. Select the light box matte, add a layer. Let's go to processing occlusion. Now you want to make sure that this node or layer is under your base shader. We also want to make sure that if you want the ambient occlusion to affect everything else, then you can place it outside of the material group. But you need to make sure that it has a base shader above of it. Otherwise, it won't work. You can see it already taking effect here, and it looks pretty good, but it's not exactly what I want. It's also not affecting the box, and the reason that's happening is because we placed this into the lightbox matte, which is great. That's what I want. I want to be able to control the occlusion on a per item level. We'll make another occlusion shader just for the box momentarily, but we need to go tweak the settings for this to get what we want. And the first thing I notice is that the distance isn't far enough for my liking. So what we'll do is we'll change the occlusion distance to 30 centimeters. That should come out a little bit more. That's quite nice. We also want to up the occlusion raise for this so the quality is a bit better. We'll go up to 256. And you'll notice right away that the quality, that it looks much, much better. And we also want to make sure that the blend mode is set to multiply, so that way it doesn't actually override anything. It's really just putting it on top of our existing materials and shaders. The other thing that I want to do is to change the bias here, and I want it to be biased more toward the black rather than the white. And so the way bias works is that 100% will skew it toward color 1, while a lower value will skew it toward color 2. We only want to increase this a little bit. So let's try out 60%. That's pretty harsh, but that looks really good. And now for the gain, what this will do is it will actually increase or decrease that skewing one direction or another. And I want to skew this more toward the black again. But a lower value will do that rather than a higher value in this case. Let's try 40 just to see if that's going to work for us. It looks good, but it's a little harsh. So let's change it to 45%. It's a minor difference, but that is much better. And now that we have that tuned into where we want it, I still think that it's a little harsh, but we don't have to go and edit all these values all over again. What we can do is just control the opacity. Let's try a value at about 60% because I'm pretty sure 50% is going to be too low. And we'll wait for a preview. It's still a little low, so let's try 65. Looks good, but I think 70% is going to be the one we want. That's the one right there. It's showing up. It's very subtle, but it's very noticeable. And it looks good. So we're going to call that good on that one. Now we can make the occlusion shader for our box material. We'll just duplicate the one we already have. So that way we don't have to tweak a whole bunch of settings. Now this one also needs to be under the base shader. We want to affect the entire box, including the cellophane. So this does need to be at the very top. Now that we have that on there, you can see how it's affecting it right away, and it looks pretty cool. But there are a few things that we can tweak here. Right off, we don't want the bias or the gain to be adjusted too much, so let's just set that to the default of 50% each. I think the distance is just fine. We don't really need this quality at all, so we'll just go down to 128 or so. The other thing too is I want it to show up a little bit more on our box. So we'll increase this just a touch, up to 75% opacity. It's just a minor adjustment, but it should help with the look of the box quite a bit. Now that we have the occlusion done, we can go back to our lighting. And I previously mentioned that we wanted to hue one of our lights, and that would be the main area light, which is our fill light here coming from the front left of the box. What we want to do is edit this area light's light material, and we want to adjust the light to a cool color. You could go in here and use this HSV color wheel, but Kelvin's going to be a lot easier. So under color model, change this to Kelvin. And we can just push this a little bit more toward blue. Not a whole lot. And we'll put it right about there at 242, 253, and 255. So we'll let preview do its thing. All right, looking cool. And now that we have our lighting and our environment maps all set up, you can see a spec kit happening right here off of one of our environment maps. And that looks pretty cool. One last thing we want to do is to actually adjust our light box itself. And the reason is because I really don't want this line showing up here at two different angles and another vertical line in the background. So in our perspective view, let's select our lightbox item. Hit the E key to rotate it. We're going to align it a little more to have it face the camera. And we'll just eyeball it. Doesn't have to be perfect. Right about there is going to get what we want. You can see that line is more or less horizontal. And that's it for the lighting. We have it all set up. Now we can move on to the next part. Now that we've finished all the other parts, we can start working on iterations, but let's discuss the pass system inside of Modo before we do so. You can create passes while you're in the render room. On the top right-hand corner, it says pass groups and passes. And to create a pass, you must first have a pass group. So you can't have one without the other. And what these allow you to do is to just have a hierarchical structure for your passes. So let's create a pass group. We'll just call this one iterations version 01. Of course, it sets up the type as render passes, and we'll set the mode to from channel edits. Now you could set this to from selected items, from selected channels, or even just item edits only. But we want channel edits, and that's going to take any channel that we edit in our scene and put that into our pass. Now we must create a pass itself, which will store all these channel edits. And we're going to call this one vertical gradient. We'll hit enter to create it. Okay, so now we have our pass group and one pass inside of it. And you can access them from the drop-down list, but you can also access all of your passes from the groups tab. And you can see right here, it's created a group for us. And if we expand out the group and then passes, you can see that pass. And if you right click on it, it allows you to rename, duplicate, and delete the passes. You can't do any of those actions from this drop down list. So keep that in mind. You can also manually add any channels that you want to here by dragging and dropping those channels into the pass. And you can see if we expand out the channels that it's automatically added all of the channels that we've edited in our scene already. That's because when we created it, it did channel edits. So we could have created an empty scene for that matter. And the reason I did this is so I can show you, we can select all these channel edits. I'm going to hold down shift after I select that top one, select the bottom one, and we can say remove channel from group. And so now we have an empty pass here. We still have our poses. We don't have any items in it or channels or anything like that. So now we're at a clean pass as if we just created an empty one. And now what we can do is go edit some channels and have them added to this pass. So make sure that you're in the pass for it to be added. And we want to turn on auto add. What this will do is that once we've edited a channel, it will automatically add it into this group without us having to manually drag and drop it in. But you want to be aware that when you don't want a channel edit into this group, it can automatically add that in there for you sometimes. For example, if you want to edit something, but you don't want it in a pass, you need to exit the pass by going up to the drop down list and hit none. If you have a pass group selected, that's still fine. That's basically the same as being in setup mode. And what setup mode is are the base values of our scene. If you make any edits to the setup mode, a lot of these edits will be propagated down to the passes, assuming you haven't added any channel edits to a pass. So let's go ahead and go back into our vertical gradient pass, turn on auto add, and what we want to do is expand out to the gradient that we created for the background color. And I just clicked on the box in the render preview, which goes to the lowest material visible. All right, and we want the whole box group. Now let's select the gradient here, go to the properties tab. I want to show you some of the things that you can and can't add into a pass. So for example, any item that has this little circle next to it, which is a keyframe indicator, can be added to a pass. So for example, the enable for the layer, invert, the blend modes, the opacity, and so on. Now the locator here, you can't keyframe this. Also, you cannot keyframe input parameters. All right, now I call this pass a vertical gradient. And the reason I did that is because I want to set up a pass with a vertical gradient rather than a radial one. And as I previously just mentioned, you cannot keyframe that. So what we need to do to make that happen is to duplicate this gradient. So let's duplicate that now. Now, while we're in this pass, we don't want to make any edits. Let's go outside of the pass. And I want to hide this gradient 2 that we just made. And in fact, let's right click, rename it. We're going to call this vertical gradient. Hit apply so that way it's applied in setup mode. Go back to a vertical gradient pass. And we're going to turn that vertical gradient on. We're going to hide the other gradient. Now to make this be applied to the pass or set those channels in the pass, we need to hit apply. Now if we exit the pass here, go to none, you'll see that the vertical gradient is hidden and the original gradient is not hidden. That's because those values are set up that way in setup mode. And in the vertical gradient pass, we have our vertical gradient visible and the original gradient hidden. And so now with our vertical gradient selected, we can select a different input parameter. So let's go to sample parameters. And I want this one to be set up to Y distance to locator. Let's unpause the render preview. And you can see now it's changed. And what I want to do here is actually to edit the keys for the gradient. So we'll just drag the green a little closer in. Let's add another keyframe with the middle mouse button and pull this a little tighter to the yellow. Zoom out so we can get 0 in our view. We'll drag the yellow closer to 0, and we'll bring this keyframe in a little bit closer to 2 centimeters there. So now we have our yellow and green vertical gradient on the box. Let's go take a look just to make sure that it's set in stone. Go to none, and now we have our radial gradient. Just to make sure that that vertical gradient's the same with those keyframes and everything. Go back to vertical gradient, And voila, we have that all set up. No problem.